Hello and welcome to Conversations with Ruth. I am Ruth. I am also known as Notorious RVG. During the time I worked with ACLU, I encountered legal aid attorneys and was always impressed with their dedication and good work. I realized that I do not know much about legal aid of North Carolina. I have wondered what legal aid really is. How is legal aid able to serve all those that are eligible for its services? That legal aid not only provides services in specific areas, but to target populations, such as veterans, seniors, Native Americans, and victims of trafficking. Equally important is what are the services legal aid provides? Well, to answer those questions, I ask that you join me in a series of interviews about getting to know legal aid of North Carolina. I promise you that I and you together, we will learn what legal aid is and what services it provides. Welcome to Conversations with Ruth. Our interview today is part of our series Getting to Know Legal Aid. We want to know what legal aid is and what it does. Today we're going to talk about private landlord-tenant practice. And recently I saw some data that is impressive. In North Carolina, last year there were over 200,000 files of summary ejectment or evictions. And those are people that receive summons and complaints. There are many people that just move out. Those numbers are staggering. And tell me why legal aid has dedicated so many resources, so many of its limited resources, I should say, to this area of practice, to prevent homelessness, to preserve shelter. So this last year, I also noticed that legal aid handled about 7,000 housing cases, of which 4,000 were in that area, in private landlord-tenant. Now, to answer my questions, what does legal aid does in this area? We have here PJ Puryear. Thank you, and I'm delighted to have you here.
Thank you, Your Honor.
PJ is a practitioner here in Raleigh. He has been a volunteer with legal aid for several years now, I understand, and he has handled many landlord-tenant cases. So I think we are lucky to have you help me get through this and answer all my questions. Let's start with something basic. What do we mean by private landlord-tenant practice?
Well, Your Honor, a private landlord-tenant relationship exists when you have a member of the community that rents a home or an apartment from a private landlord. And what I mean by private landlord would be a person like you or me or a private company, as opposed to someone who's staying in an apartment or a home that receives government subsidies.
I see. Okay. So different than what we call subsidized housing.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
So in the private landlord-tenant area, what types of cases legal aid commonly handles?
Well, there are three areas that we see the most of, Your Honor. The first, as you mentioned, are evictions or summary ejectments, which are incredibly high in North Carolina. The second area is where a person has a home that has some kind of problem that the landlord should fix, a repair that the landlord's not making, and they need assistance in dealing with that landlord to try and have those repairs made. The third category are problems or cases that fall under the Fair Housing Act and try and help tenants understand what their rights are under that statute.
So let's say someone has received notice of eviction, whether it is the legal summons or the landlord send them a letter telling them you have to move out, and they call legal aid. What can they expect?
Well, legal aid does a good job of getting folks in touch with lawyers and volunteers who have experience with the problems that they're facing. So if someone calls into legal aid and they've received an eviction notice, or like a case I'm handled recently, there was problems with the decking on the outside of the house that the landlord wouldn't fix. Mm-hmm. They'd call into legal aid, they'd explain what their problem is or what kind of legal action they're facing, and then legal aid would get them in touch with an attorney who would then have a phone call with them or have a meeting with them, learn what the facts are, try and assess legally what the rights are of the tenant. And then from there, it can go a number of different ways. A lot of times what happens in my cases is I'll be able to provide advice that the tenant then can use to negotiate the situation and find a resolution on their own. Sometimes I'll involve myself by calling the landlord and see if I can't work out a resolution. In some instances, when no resolution can be created in that situation and litigation is needed or representation in court is needed, legal aid volunteers, if they're able, can engage and be present in court or help the tenant file whatever necessary legal papers they need to file to try and reach a resolution through the court system.
Well, that's wonderful to hear, because I do recall when I was at the bench that so many people that are not represented have limitations, and it's very difficult for them to maneuver the process.
It is, Your Honor. It is.
And you have done some of those cases?
I have. So to go back to the case that I was telling you about, a lady who I'll call Samantha called into legal aid. She was having a problem with the decking outside of her porch, and in fact, she had tripped and fell and had torn her ACL in her knee. And the landlord was obstinate, would refuse to fix the boarding in the apartment. And so we began negotiations with the landlord. It was clear that that wasn't going to resolve the situation. And so I was then able to provide advice that allowed Samantha to utilize the legal system to try and figure out if there was a solution. Ultimately, in that case, the solution was for her to move out, to find a safer place to live. And we're in continued negotiations with the landlord to try and seek some financial remedies for her situation. But our jobs as legal aid volunteers are to be there, to provide information and assistance as far as we can. And sometimes the answer isn't always the court system. It's something else.
That's correct.
And so in my experience, at least, I try and not only apply legal analysis, but just common sense. So trying to help people figure out the solution to their problems.
And you know, what you mentioned brings me to an area that legal aid handles and uses some resources to approach clients in education, community education. You mentioned this client wanted to know what she could do, what her legal rights are. Tenants seem to want to know how much time I have, can I withhold rent, can the landlord do this or that? In that sense, what does legal aid do to provide education to the community?
An incredible deal, Your Honor. One of the things that legal aid does regularly is try to provide clinics in the community that answer the exact questions that you just asked. Right? What are my rights? What are my obligations under my lease, under the statutes? Can I withhold rent? Is this a contract I should sign? So legal aid tries to create opportunities for members of the community to educate themselves about what their rights and remedies are. But legal aid's efforts don't stop there. One of the other things that legal aid has been excellent at providing are self-help materials. And in fact, as a practitioner, I've been able to gain from those materials just as much as I think someone else in the community can. They try to enable both citizens and attorneys easy access to information that folks can use to help themselves or to help others. And those have been really helpful to me in my practice and in my volunteerism with legal aid.
Well, and with numbers as the ones I mentioned, it's not possible for legal aid to have attorneys for each one that needs assistance in this area.
That's correct.
A little while ago, I learned that there are 24,000 eligible individuals for each legal aid attorney. So we have to provide community education.
It sounds like, Your Honor, we need to up the number of attorneys volunteering for this program too, don't we?
We do.
That's
we
right.
do.
That's right.
And you mentioned fair housing. That's interesting. I look in the website. Well, actually, my clerk did, and just gave me the information. There is a project called the Fair Housing Initiative Project. I don't know, you're familiar with it?
I'm not. Tell me about it.
Well, it is a project, it appears to have attorneys specialized in Fair Housing Act, and they serve the entire state and provide co-counseling to attorneys involved in cases. For example, the case that you mentioned, it could have been a case where the person had a disability and the landlord refused to provide accommodations. They get involved in those cases. And those are obviously defenses that are important.
They are. You know, it's interesting you mentioned the website. I was looking on the website today and I saw another project that Legal Aid has. It's called the Eviction Diversion Project. Have you heard about that?
That's right.
Apparently, it's a project where Legal Aid is teaming up with DSS and Duke Law. DSS provides the funding, Duke Law provides the volunteers, and they go into the community, find people who are on the doorstep of eviction, provide funding, sometimes in the form of paying rent, provide legal representation.
Wonderful.
They've actually helped, I think, let me check and make sure I've got the number right, 79% of the clients they've helped have avoided eviction. So that's just another example of Legal Aid taking, as you said, their unfortunately limited resources and putting it to good work in the communities that need it.
And true, that is fascinating. I am impressed by that project that you mentioned, because sometimes unique events cause somebody to miss rent for 1 month, and they can recover if they get the help at that moment.
That's right.
Good to hear that. PJ, I think we have reached the end of our time. Not only you have taught me some things that I didn't know, but now I am quite sure that with the limited resources Legal Aid has, it can help many of these people. Thank you so much for your participation. And for those that are viewing this episode, I want to invite you to future episodes in which we will talk about other areas of law that Legal Aid handles. Thank you.